So moving on to lab 6, first I had to ensure that the connection strings were right and all the same in the app.config, web.config, and both DB contexts, again to ensure that all tables were created in the same database. And there you can see them. There. And there. So I installed the activity tracker and the other usual practices, and then went about seeding roles for admin, club admin, and normal users, and added one admin user in the config file of the MVC. And then in the class library configuration file, I seeded all the students from the attached Excel CSV file with this method here, and then just context.student entity author update, and calling that method and putting it to an array. I then stored a list of all the students and used a loop to store the first 10 students in another list called 10 students. And I would have used the take method instead, but the for loop just came to me naturally. So then I passed that 10 students list into a method which returned into a method there like that, along with the club context. The returns them as a list of member type, setting the approved to false while they're being created, and setting the club ID to the club ID of the club that's been targeted by the current iteration of the for loop. This is useful because if we had more than one club, this would be maintainable, but no, we don't. So I then added these 10 member type members to the member table. I changed the properties of the first member of the member table with this method here. I set the approved property to true for that member, and the admin ID of the club to the member ID of that member as well. Then in the MVC, I used the application user manager and for each loop to loop through all the members of the club to populate them as application users and give them all a role of member. And you can see here I stored the first row of the members table as a member type variable, and I gave that member the role of club admin as well as the role of member that was already assigned down here. Then in the layout view in the shared view folder, we use an if else statement to ensure that only users with the role of admin can see the link to manage the clubs. We then protect the controller so that only authorized users can access the controller actions and associated views, in this case anyone with the role of admin. You can see we do that here. And the reason we need to do this is because any normal member would be able to access the club controller and associated views if they knew the root path. They could just type it into the browser and access it like that. So we need to prevent this from happening. So moving on to lab 7, I added a model view class called club view models, which would be used as a model later for the creation of a view. It acts as a model schema type thing for the data to follow, like a structure. Then I created a club admin controller with reference to user manager in the club context. I marked the controller with an authorize again, this time with both the roles of admin and club admin. And I added this statement in the layout view to only show the link to the controller if the user is in one of the specified roles. And we can check the roles again with the SQL query for the roles. So you can just right click and do new query and paste that in, run that, and then we'll get the results down at the bottom. I then deleted the index view in the club controller view folder and remade it this time using a details template and the business context from the club context from the class library. Then on the controller we create an index action that populates a list of clubs based on where the admin ID of the club matches the ID of the current user if there's a match at all. Otherwise it'll tell them that they either have no clubs to maintain or else that they don't have the correct role to manage any clubs. And then change the index view so that it would display a list of clubs on the creation date with some headers above and a button with an embedded action view that would pass in the club ID of the club admin is authorized to administrate based on the admin ID and member ID match. We then create a new action called approve on the controller, which takes in the club ID passed back from the index view and finds the club associated with this ID and maps all the properties into the maintain club view model that we created earlier, and this model is returned as a view to the user. So I had to right click on the controller action, approve, and generate a view using an edit template with no data context. I then added two tables that looped through both the approved and unapproved members in the newly populated maintain club view model. And then back on my club admin controller, I added a HTTP post action result called approve, which relayed approvals and revokes back to the database and to the browser. And then moving on to lab 8, we added a new DB set for the club events. and a navigation property in the club class for the club events class. Because these actions make changes to the context and the database structure, we need to add a new migration and update the database to see these changes take effect. Next, in the configuration file of the class library, we create 3 clubs and create inline events for each of the clubs. Next, we created a controller called club events and a controller action called all club details, and an associated empty view, which means it has no template or model class. I can see it here. This view will display all the club events for each club in a table and add an action link in the nav bar to the club events controller. There's a search box and a button to refine the table contents to an individual club. Next, we created a partial view with a list template, and we just add a reference to the partial view from the index view. And you can see that we did that here. And this view has a drop down list which we can use to filter which club we'd like to see the events for.